So Scotland has this really bold plan to compete on the world's economic stage. But behind the famous global grands and, its green ambitions, there's a fascinating story of some pretty deep-seated challenges. In this explainer, we're going to break down that story for you.
We're digging into a super detailed report by the Fraser of Allender Institute to unpack the complex layers of Scotland's economy, everything from its iconic exports to its green energy future. And look, this isn't just a bunch of numbers. It's about a nation that's really at a strategic crossroads.
And that brings us to the big question for this whole thing. How does a nation like Scotland, with all its unique assets and obstacles, actually go about building its economic future in what is a hyper-competitive world?
All right, let's dive right into part one, the export engine. This is where Scotland's most famous global brands really get to shine.
And you really can't talk about Scottish exports without talking about this. In 2022, Scotch whiskey exports hit a staggering £6.2 billion. What's so cool here is how it perfectly links trade with tourism. People don't just buy the whiskey, they actually travel to Scotland to see where it all comes from.
But here's the thing. Underneath all that success, there's a real tension. While almost all of the small businesses are local, it's the foreign-owned firms that are dominating the high-growth scene. So you've got this huge divide between this broad base of local companies and a really small but powerful group of international players driving all the growth.
And, this quote from business leaders who are part of the report, man, it just hits the nail on the head. There's this pattern where a successful Scottish startup gets to a certain size, and then boom, it gets bought up, moving all that control and the future profits out of the country. So all of this naturally leads us to the next piece of the playbook, attracting global capital. And this is where we run into something people are calling the Scottish paradox. Okay, so on one side of the coin, Scotland is absolutely crushing it. Outside of London, it's the #1 spot in the UK for foreign direct investment. That's basically money from overseas companies setting up shop. The tech scene is just booming. Clearly, the country has a really compelling pitch for global investors.
And a huge part of that appeal is the world-class universities. Now, what's really amazing is that in cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh, over 20% of all the equity deals go to companies that started out in a university. That's more than double the UK average. I mean, that's a phenomenal pipeline of innovation right there. But here is the paradox. This chart just lays it all out. While the ideas are flowing, turning them into big commercial successes is a major struggle. Just look at that drop. From representing nearly a third of the UK's spin-out turnover all the way down to just 4% in a few years. It's a classic case of having amazing innovation, but struggling to scale. So why is this happening? Well, this feedback from investors gives us a big clue. You get the sense that even with all the opportunity, the actual on-the-ground experience of doing business can be a huge barrier. It's just too frustrating for some.
And if you want to put a hard number on that frustration, get this. That's the average time it takes to get a decision on a major development application. I mean, if you're an investor ready to put money to work, waiting almost a full year can be a total deal breaker. You're just going to look somewhere else.
But it's not all bad news, right? There are some really clear models for how to fix things. Take Women's Enterprise Scotland. They're not just talking about it, they're providing super practical, targeted support, from boardroom training to policy workshops to tackle the gender imbalance in entrepreneurship, which the report says is a huge source of untapped potential. Okay, let's shift gears to the final and honestly maybe the most defining part of this whole story. Scotland's massive bet on becoming a world leader in the green economy.
And we're talking about enormous potential here. Thanks to its incredible natural resources and, a pretty consistent policy direction, Scotland is ranked #1 in the entire UK for its green growth opportunities. It's in a perfect position to lead this transition.
And this isn't just talk. We're looking at some of the most aggressive climate targets on the planet. Aiming for net zero by 2045, a full 5 years before the rest of the UK, sends a huge signal to investors that Scotland is dead serious about the green economy. And they're already making incredible progress. Scotland already generates the equivalent of pretty much 100% of its electricity needs from renewables, with onshore wind doing most of the heavy lifting. But, and this is a big but, the really tough nuts to crack are still ahead: heat and transport. And this quote, it just perfectly captures how hard this is. You can't just flip an off switch on an industry that's been a powerhouse for decades. It has to be a super careful managed process to protect tens of thousands of jobs and a massive part of the economy. And this chart really shows you why it's such a massive challenge. Even with all the amazing progress in renewable electricity, domestic transport is still the single biggest source of emissions. To fix that, you're talking about a fundamental, massive change in infrastructure and behavior. That's a huge hurdle.
All right, so let's zoom out and pull all these different threads together. We've seen these incredible strengths, but also some really deep-rooted challenges. So, where does Scotland go from here? When you boil it all down, Scotland's entire economic future really comes down to solving these three huge tensions. Can it get the benefits of global cash without losing its best local companies? Can it finally turn its brilliant ideas into world-beating businesses? And can it successfully manage that tricky transition from its fossil fuel past to its green future?
Look, the plan is there, the resources are there, the talent is absolutely there. Scotland has a world-class playbook. But the big question we'll leave you with is this. Can it actually create the conditions it needs, from reforming planning to changing the investment culture, to truly execute that plan and win on the global stage?